The gavel slams down. Judge Whitmore leans forward, his thin lips curling into a sneer as he stares at 15-year-old Amara Thompson standing in the gallery. Her hand trembles, clutching a folder stuffed with papers. Her father sits in an orange jumpsuit, handcuffed, his eyes pleading with her to sit down. The judge's voice booms through the courtroom. "This isn't a game, little girl. Sit down before I hold you in contempt." The entire room watches. Amara takes one step forward instead. "Your Honor, with respect, you need to hear this evidence." The room gasps. 3 weeks earlier, Amara's life looked completely different. She was a straight-A student at Jefferson High School, carrying a 4.0 grade point average and dreaming of becoming a civil rights attorney just like Thurgood Marshall. Her bedroom walls were covered with posters of Supreme Court justices and famous legal cases. Every night after finishing her homework, she would read case law for fun, annotating legal briefs and imagining herself arguing before judges. Her father, Amara Thompson, was her hero. At 42 years old, he owned Thompson's Auto Repair in their working-class black neighborhood on the south side of Montgomery, Alabama. He had built the business from nothing, working 16-hour days to provide for Amara and her mother. The community respected him. He was honest, reliable, the kind of man who would fix a single mother's car for free if she couldn't afford it, who mentored young men in the neighborhood and kept them off the streets. Amara loved spending Saturday afternoons at the shop, watching her father work, listening to him explain engine mechanics with the same patience he showed when helping her with algebra. One late Tuesday evening, everything changed. Marcus was working alone at the shop, catching up on repairs. Around 7:30, a luxury Mercedes pulled into the lot. The driver was Derek Callahan, a white businessman in his late 30s, who Amara's father had never met before. Callahan seemed nervous, fidgeting with his keys, sweat beading on his forehead despite the cool autumn air. He explained that his brakes felt wrong, that something was off with the car's handling. He needed it fixed immediately and offered to pay double Marcus's usual rate for rush service. Marcus agreed, always willing to help a customer in need. As he inspected the vehicle, he noticed something unusual. The Mercedes had clearly been in a recent accident. There were paint scrapes along the passenger side, a dented rear bumper, and the front alignment was slightly off. When Marcus mentioned this to Callahan, the man became defensive, insisting the car had always been like that, demanding Marcus just fix the brakes and nothing else. Marcus found it strange, but figured maybe the man was embarrassed about the accident. He did what he always did, documenting everything meticulously. He took photos of the vehicle from every angle, noted the existing damage on his work order, recorded the exact time Callahan dropped off the car, and even captured the odometer reading. These were standard practices that had protected him from liability disputes in the past. Callahan signed the work order and left in a hurry, saying he would return the next morning to pick up the vehicle. Marcus worked on the Mercedes until after 10 that evening, replacing the brake pads and checking the entire system. He locked up the shop, drove home, and kissed Amara goodnight, never imagining that this ordinary repair job would destroy their lives. The next morning arrived with violence. At 6:15, Amara was jarred awake by thunderous pounding on the front door. She stumbled out of bed, confused, and heard her mother screaming. Through her bedroom doorway, she saw police officers flooding into their small house, weapons drawn, shouting commands. Her father was dragged from his bedroom in his underwear, thrown to the floor, handcuffed roughly as officers screamed at him to stop resisting, even though he wasn't moving. Amara rushed forward, but her mother grabbed her, holding her back as she sobbed. The lead detective, a white man with cold eyes, read Marcus his rights. "Marcus Thompson, you're under arrest for grand theft auto and receiving stolen property. The Mercedes you have in your possession was reported stolen and used in a hit-and-run accident that severely injured an elderly woman. Security footage shows you driving the vehicle." Marcus kept saying he didn't understand, that a customer had brought the car in for repairs, that he had documentation. The police weren't interested. They hauled him away in handcuffs while neighbors watched from their porches, whispering, judging. Amara and her mother, Linda, were left standing in their destroyed living room, furniture overturned from the search, unable to process what had just happened. The bail hearing was a nightmare. The judge set bail at $50,000, an impossible amount for their family. Linda worked as a nurse at Montgomery General, often pulling double shifts to help make ends meet, but they had no savings for something like this. They called everyone they knew, begging for help. Family members contributed what little they could. Their church community rallied, passing collection plates, organizing fundraisers. It took 4 agonizing days, but they finally scraped together enough for a bail bondsman. When Marcus came home, he looked broken. He had lost 15 pounds, his eyes were hollow, and he barely spoke. The shop had been seized as potential evidence. Without income, their family was drowning. But worse than the financial stress was the social isolation. Walking through their neighborhood, Amara felt eyes on her everywhere. At the grocery store, white shoppers clutched their purses tighter when she passed. At school, teachers who once praised her now looked at her with pity or suspicion. Her best friend Emma, who was white, stopped returning her texts. When Amara finally confronted her in the hallway, Emma's response was cold and final. "My parents said, 'I can't be friends with you anymore. Your father's a criminal. He hurt that woman and he's going to prison. I'm sorry.'" She walked away without looking back. Even some members of the black community began to distance themselves. A few church members stopped coming by with casseroles. Neighbors who once waved now avoided eye contact. Amara overheard Mrs. Patterson from across the street telling someone that Marcus must have done something wrong or the police wouldn't have arrested him. The isolation was suffocating. The public defender assigned to Marcus's case was a young white man named Stephen Bradley, who looked perpetually exhausted. He met with them exactly once, in a cramped office that smelled like stale coffee, reviewing the case file for perhaps 15 minutes before delivering his verdict. The evidence is pretty damning. They have security footage, witness testimony, and the stolen vehicle was found in your possession. My advice is to take a plea deal. If you plead guilty to the theft charge, the DA might drop the hit and run. You'd be looking at maybe 5 to 7 years instead of 20. Marcus nearly collapsed. "I didn't steal anything. A man brought that car to me for repairs. I have documentation, timestamps, everything." Bradley barely looked up from his notes. "Sir, that's what they all say. Look, I've got 37 other cases right now. This is Alabama. The jury's going to be mostly white. You're a black man accused of a serious crime. The math isn't in your favor. Take the deal." Amara, who had been sitting quietly in the corner, spoke up. "What about investigating Derek Callahan? He's the one who brought the car to my father. If we can find him, prove he's lying, everything changes." Bradley actually laughed, a harsh, condescending sound. "You think a respected businessman framed your dad? This is Alabama, sweetheart. People don't do things like that. Your father made a mistake, got caught, and now he needs to minimize the damage. Take the deal or face 20 years in prison." The meeting ended with nothing resolved. Walking to their car, Marcus put his arm around Amara and whispered, "Maybe he's right. Maybe I should just take the deal. Save you and your mother from going through a trial." Amara stopped walking and looked up at her father. This man who had taught her to stand up for what was right, who had shown her that integrity mattered more than convenience. "No, Dad, you're innocent. If we give up now, you go to prison for something you didn't do. I won't let that happen." That night, lying in bed, Amara made a decision that would change everything. If no one else would fight for her father, she would do it herself. Amara began her investigation the next morning, skipping school for the first time in her life. She walked 3 miles to the Montgomery Public Library, a massive stone building that smelled like old paper and possibility. The librarian, an older black woman named Mrs. Chen, noticed the determined look on Amara's face and asked if she needed help. Amara explained her situation, and Mrs. Chen's expression shifted from curiosity to solidarity. She led Amara to the law section, showing her where to find criminal procedure guides, evidence rules, and case law databases. For the next 8 hours, Amara read. She studied Alabama criminal statutes, learning about burden of proof, reasonable doubt, and the prosecution's obligation to establish guilt beyond any uncertainty. She memorized evidence rules, understanding what could and couldn't be presented in court, how to authenticate documents, how to establish chains of custody. She read appellate decisions, seeing how higher courts had overturned convictions based on procedural errors or insufficient evidence. Her head ached from the dense legal language, but she pushed through, taking meticulous notes in a spiral notebook. That evening, she returned home with a backpack full of photocopied cases and 3 library books on criminal defense. Her mother was furious that she had skipped school, but when Amara showed her the research, explained what she was learning, Linda's anger melted into something else. Pride mixed with fear. "Baby, you can't take this on yourself. You're 15 years old." Amara met her mother's eyes. "Then who's going to do it, Mama? That public defender doesn't care. The system doesn't care. If we don't fight, Daddy goes to prison for 20 years. I can't just sit here and let that happen." For the next 2 weeks, Amara lived at the library and in the school computer lab. She created a timeline of events, mapping every moment of the night in question. She obtained copies of the police report through a public records request, paying the small fee with money from her birthday savings. She studied the security footage that allegedly showed her father driving the stolen Mercedes. The video was grainy, shot from a distance, showing someone in what looked like Marcus's work uniform driving the vehicle at 8:45 in the evening. But something bothered her about the timestamp. She cross-referenced it with her father's cell phone records, which the family phone plan allowed her to access online. At 8:45 that night, Marcus's phone had been actively used to call a parts supplier, and the cell tower data showed his phone was located at the auto shop, not 3 miles away where the security camera was positioned. The timeline didn't work. She dug deeper into her father's documentation. Marcus had security cameras at his shop, basic models but functional. She reviewed the footage from that night, watching her father work on the Mercedes from 7:30 until well after 10, never leaving the property. The timestamps were clear and matched perfectly with other verifiable data, like his phone records and credit card receipts from ordering dinner delivery at 9:15. There was no way her father could have driven that Mercedes at 8:45 when he was provably at his shop. Excited by this discovery, Amara brought her findings to Stephen Bradley. She scheduled an appointment, arrived with organized folders, and presented her evidence clearly and methodically. Bradley looked at her timeline, glanced at the phone records, and shrugged. "Timestamps can be wrong. Security footage gets mixed up. This doesn't prove anything except that your father has phone records, which could have been manufactured. Judge Whitmore won't care about technical details like this. It's not enough to create reasonable doubt." Amara felt frustration rising, but it proves he couldn't have been in 2 places at once. The cell tower data is scientific evidence. Bradley closed her folder and slid it back across his desk. "Miss Thompson, I appreciate your effort, but you're not a lawyer. You don't understand how these things work. The prosecution has physical evidence. Your father had possession of a stolen vehicle. Everything else is just noise." He stood, indicating the meeting was over. "I strongly suggest your family accept the plea deal before it's taken off the table." As Amara left his office, she realized something crucial. The public defender wasn't just incompetent or overworked. He had already decided her father was guilty. He wasn't going to fight because he didn't believe Marcus deserved a fight. The system had made up its mind before the trial even started. Back at school, life became increasingly difficult. White students whispered as she walked by. Someone wrote "Thief's Daughter" on her locker in permanent marker. Her chemistry teacher missed her. Roberts, who had written her a glowing recommendation letter just months before, now barely made eye contact with her. When she raised her hand to answer questions, he called on other students. In the cafeteria, Amara sat alone, eating her lunch while watching her former friends laugh at tables across the room. The isolation was crushing, but she used it. Every lunch period, she pulled out her legal research, studying instead of socializing. When other students went to pep rallies or football games, Amara was in the library, building her case. But even within the black community, support was wavering. At church on Sunday, Some families who had initially helped with bail money now avoided them. Amara overheard Mrs. Jenkins telling someone that maybe Marcus had gotten involved with the wrong people, that good men don't get arrested without reason. The presumption of innocence seemed to evaporate when the accused was black. The only person who truly believed in Amara's mission was Mrs. Eleanor Price, the court clerk at Montgomery County Courthouse. Mrs. Price was 68, had worked in the judicial system for 40 years, and attended the same Baptist church as Amara's family. She had seen countless black defendants railroaded through a system designed to convict rather than seek truth. When Amara approached her after church one Sunday, explaining her research and her struggle to understand courtroom procedures, Mrs. Price saw something special. This child wasn't just trying to save her father. She was trying to save them all from a system that had failed their community for generations. Mrs. Price began quietly helping. She provided Amara with copies of court filings, explained procedural rules in plain language, and even gave her a crash course in courtroom etiquette. You have to speak clearly, look the judge in the eye, cite your sources properly. If you show weakness, they'll destroy you. Amara soaked up every piece of advice like a sponge. One evening, while researching in the courthouse's public law library, Amara discovered something that made her blood run cold. She found archived newspaper articles about Judge Harold Whitmore, the man who would preside over her father's trial. The articles painted a disturbing picture. Over 15 years on the bench, Whitmore had developed a reputation for harsh sentencing, particularly in cases involving black defendants. Amara counted the cases she could find. In 92% of trials involving black defendants, Whitmore had ruled against them or imposed maximum sentences. Several appeals had been filed, citing judicial bias, but all were dismissed by higher courts that seemed reluctant to challenge a sitting judge. The pattern was undeniable, but it was one article from 3 years ago that explained everything. Judge Whitmore's only son, Daniel, had been killed by a drunk driver. The driver was a 23-year-old black man named Jerome Patterson, who had already had 2 prior DUIs. Patterson was convicted and sentenced to only 4 years in prison due to a plea deal. The article quoted Judge Whitmore at the sentencing, his voice breaking as he talked about justice denied. Since his son's death, Whitmore's sentencing had become even harsher toward black defendants, as if he was punishing the entire community for one man's crime. Amara understood with terrible clarity. Her father wasn't just facing the law. He was facing a judge seeking revenge, trying to balance cosmic scales that had been tipped by personal tragedy. It wasn't about evidence or justice. It was about making someone pay, and her father had become the sacrificial target. She brought this information to her parents that night, spreading the newspaper articles across their kitchen table. Marcus stared at the papers, his face growing pale. Linda covered her mouth with her hand. They all understood what this meant. The trial was rigged before it even started. That night, Amara couldn't sleep. She lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, her mind racing through legal strategies and procedural options. She thought about all the civil rights heroes she had studied, people who had faced impossible systems and found cracks in the armor. Thurgood Marshall, arguing Brown versus Board of Education. Rosa Parks refusing to move from her seat. Young students sitting at segregated lunch counters, enduring violence to expose injustice. They had all been ordinary people who decided that enough was enough. If they could face down the entire weight of institutional racism, surely she could face one biased judge. The trial was set to begin in 1 week. Amara had 7 days to prepare for the fight of her life. The morning of the trial arrived with oppressive humidity that made the air feel thick enough to choke on. Amara dressed carefully in the one formal outfit she owned, a navy blue dress her mother had bought for church, paired with shoes that pinched her toes. Marcus wore a borrowed suit that hung slightly loose on his frame, evidence of the weight he had lost during this ordeal. They drove to the Montgomery County Courthouse in silence, each lost in their own thoughts and fears. The courthouse itself was imposing, a massive structure built in 1865, all white columns and marble steps that seemed designed to intimidate rather than welcome. Inside, the air conditioning barely worked, and the building smelled like old wood and decades of desperation. They passed through security, where guards looked at Marcus with obvious suspicion, and made their way to courtroom C on the second floor. The courtroom was smaller than Amara had imagined from television shows, with wooden benches for the gallery, a jury box to the right, and the judge's bench elevated above everything else like a throne. People were already filing in, filling the seats. Amara noticed the demographics immediately. The potential jurors sitting in the gallery were overwhelmingly white, mostly older, mostly looking at her father, with expressions ranging from curiosity to outright hostility. A few black community members had come to show support, sitting in the back rows, but they were vastly outnumbered. At 9 o'clock sharp, everyone stood as Judge Harold Whitmore entered through a side door. He was exactly as Amara had imagined from the photos. Late 50s, thin gray hair combed precisely, sharp features that seemed perpetually arranged in a scowl, and eyes that held no warmth whatsoever. He wore his black robe like armor, and surveyed the courtroom with the air of someone who viewed himself as the ultimate authority on all matters. His gaze lingered on Marcus for a moment, and Amara could have sworn she saw something dark flicker across his face before he assumed a mask of judicial neutrality. "Court is now in session. Be seated." His voice was surprisingly soft, but carried an edge of absolute command. Jury selection took most of the morning, and Amara watched with growing dread as Stephen Bradley, their public defender, failed to challenge obvious bias. One potential juror openly stated he believed most crimes in Montgomery were committed by black men. Bradley didn't object. Another juror mentioned she had been a victim of theft once and had strong feelings about property crime. Bradley let her stay. By lunchtime, they had an all-white jury. 12 people who would decide her father's fate, and not one of them looked like him or understood his life. The actual trial began after lunch. District Attorney Rebecca Walsh was everything Stephen Bradley wasn't. 45 years old, impeccably dressed in a charcoal suit, she moved through the courtroom with practiced confidence. Her opening statement was devastating. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is a simple case. The defendant, Marcus Thompson, had possession of a stolen vehicle. That vehicle was used in a hit-and-run accident that left an innocent woman, Mrs. Patricia Henderson, with permanent injuries. The evidence will show that Mr. Thompson was seen driving this vehicle after it was reported stolen. We have security footage. We have witness testimony. We have the stolen car found at his shop. The defendant wants you to believe he's a victim, but the facts tell a different story. This is a man who saw an opportunity to profit from someone else's misery and took it. Justice demands accountability." Walsh called her first witness, Mrs. Patricia Henderson herself. The injured woman was wheeled into the courtroom in a wheelchair, her leg in a cast, her face still showing fading bruises. She was 72 years old, white, a retired schoolteacher who had lived in Montgomery her entire life. She testified in a shaky voice about the accident. She had been crossing the street near her home when a Mercedes came out of nowhere, speeding through a red light, striking her and throwing her 15 feet. The driver never stopped, never even slowed down. She spent 3 weeks in the hospital with broken bones, internal bleeding, and trauma that still gave her nightmares. Amara watched the jury as Mrs. Henderson spoke. Their faces showed pure sympathy. Several jurors were openly crying. Walsh was brilliant, keeping the old woman on the stand just long enough to cement the emotional impact before yielding to Bradley for cross-examination. Stephen Bradley stood, shuffled his notes, and asked exactly 2 questions. "Mrs. Henderson, did you get a clear look at the driver?" "No, I was in too much shock." "Can you identify the race of the driver?" The woman hesitated. "I believe it was a black man, but I'm not certain." Bradley sat down, apparently satisfied. Amara wanted to scream. He should have asked about lighting conditions, about whether Mrs. Henderson was wearing her glasses, about the fact that shock and trauma affect memory reliability. There were a dozen ways to challenge her testimony without attacking her as a person, but Bradley did nothing. Walsh then presented the security footage. The courtroom lights dimmed as a screen lowered. The video played, grainy, and shot from a significant distance, showing a parking lot camera view. At the timestamp of 8:45, a Mercedes entered the frame, driving through the lot. The driver was visible only as a dark silhouette, wearing what appeared to be a mechanic's uniform, similar to what Marcus wore. The car circled once, then exited. The footage was poor quality, the driver's face completely obscured, but Walsh narrated as if it definitively proved guilt. As you can see, the defendant's vehicle, identifiable by these distinctive characteristics, being driven at the exact time and location of the hit and run. Walsh called a police detective who testified about finding the stolen Mercedes at Marcus's shop, about how the vehicle's damage matched the injuries to Mrs. Henderson, about how Marcus had no credible explanation for having the car. She called an accident reconstruction expert who explained that the damage patterns on both the vehicle and the victim proved this was the car involved in the hit and run. She called Derek Callahan. Amara's entire body tensed as the man who had destroyed her family took the stand. He was 38, attractive in a polished way, wearing an expensive suit and an expression of practiced concern. He testified smoothly, his voice confident and sympathetic. He explained how he had reported his Mercedes stolen at 9:15 that evening after leaving it parked outside a restaurant. He had no idea how it ended up at Thompson's shop. He suggested that maybe Marcus had found it abandoned and instead of reporting it, had tried to part it out for profit. Under cross-examination, Bradley asked almost nothing of substance. "Mr. Callahan, are you certain about the timeline?" "Absolutely. Did you know Mr. Thompson before this incident?" "Never met him in my life." Bradley sat down. Amara gripped her folder so hard her knuckles turned white. She had evidence that destroyed every word of Callahan's testimony. She had proof he was lying, that he had brought the car to her father, that the timeline Walsh presented was impossible, but Bradley wasn't presenting any of it. By the end of the second day, the prosecution rested. Their case was simple, compelling, and entirely circumstantial, but Bradley had failed to challenge any of it effectively. The defense's turn came on day 3, and it was a disaster from the start. Bradley called character witnesses who testified that Marcus was a good man, honest, hardworking. Under Walsh's ruthless cross-examination, she got them to admit they weren't with Marcus on the night in question, that they couldn't actually prove he didn't steal the car, that being a good neighbor didn't mean someone couldn't commit a crime. She destroyed each witness methodically. Bradley tried to introduce Marcus's alibi evidence, the shop security footage, and cell phone records. But he failed to properly authenticate the footage, couldn't establish chain of custody, and Walsh objected on technical grounds. Judge Whitmore sustained every single prosecution objection. The footage was excluded. The phone records were deemed hearsay without proper foundation. Every piece of evidence that could have saved Marcus was thrown out because Bradley didn't know how to introduce it properly. Amara sat in the gallery, watching her father's defense collapse, watching justice die in real time. Judge Whitmore's bias was subtle but unmistakable. He sustained 90% of Walsh's objections while overruling every defense motion. He rushed Bradley through his questioning but gave Walsh unlimited time. His instructions to the jury were carefully worded but contained phrases that presumed guilt. The defendant had possession of stolen property. The question is simply whether he knowingly committed this act. On the 4th day, Marcus took the stand. He told his story simply and honestly. A customer brought the car in for repairs. "I documented everything like I always do. I never stole anything. I'm innocent." Under Walsh's cross-examination, he fell apart. She hammered him about his financial troubles, suggesting desperation drove him to crime. She questioned why he didn't find it suspicious that someone wanted rush service on an expensive car. She picked apart every detail until Marcus was sweating, stumbling over his words, looking exactly like what the jury expected. A guilty man trying to lie his way to freedom. The worst moment came during recess on day 4. Amara needed to use the restroom and was walking back to the courtroom when she heard voices from an open doorway. She recognized them immediately. D.A. Walsh and Judge Whitmore, talking in what they thought was privacy. "We need this conviction." Walsh's voice was low but urgent. "The Henderson family is influential, major donors to the county. They're demanding justice." Whitmore responded, his tone casual. "Don't worry. I'll make sure it sticks. One more black criminal off the streets won't hurt anyone. These people need to learn there are consequences." Amara's hands shook as she pulled out her phone and hit record, capturing the last part of the conversation. The audio was muffled but clear enough. She had evidence of judicial corruption, of a conspiracy to convict her father regardless of evidence. But she also knew that presenting it would mean exposing herself, making herself a target. That evening, she showed the recording to her parents. Her father put his head in his hands. Her mother cried. They all knew what it meant. The trial was fixed. There had never been any chance of acquittal. The system wasn't broken. It was working exactly as designed, to convict black men and maintain a social order built on racial hierarchy. On day 5, closing arguments began. Walsh delivered a masterful summary, weaving together the evidence into a narrative of guilt that felt inevitable. Ladies and gentlemen, the facts are clear. The defendant had means, motive, and opportunity. He had the stolen vehicle. He was seen driving it. An innocent woman was nearly killed. Justice demands a guilty verdict. When Bradley stood for his closing, Amara could barely watch. He was apologetic, defensive, conceding half the prosecution's points before even trying to challenge them. He talked about reasonable doubt in abstract terms, but failed to point to specific weaknesses in the state's case. It was a surrender disguised as a defense. As he sat down, Amara felt her last hope dying. Judge Whitmore began instructing the jury on the law. His words were technically correct, but emphasized prosecution theories, minimized defense arguments, and used language that presumed guilt. The jury will consider whether the defendant knowingly possessed stolen property. Possession alone can establish guilt if other factors are present. Amara stood. She didn't plan to, didn't think about it. Her body simply refused to sit quietly while her father was sent to prison for a crime he didn't commit. Every eye in the courtroom turned to her. Judge Whitmore stopped mid-sentence, his face darkening. The gavel came down hard. "Young lady, sit down immediately." Judge Whitmore's voice was sharp, a whip crack in the silent courtroom, but Amara had gone past the point of fear. Her voice emerged stronger than she expected, carrying to every corner of the room. "Your Honor, I have evidence that proves my father's innocence. Evidence that hasn't been presented to this jury." The courtroom erupted in whispers. Marcus half stood from the defense table, reaching toward her. "Baby, please." Stephen Bradley looked panicked, waving his hands. "Your Honor, I apologize. The child doesn't understand." Walsh stood as well, her expression a mix of outrage and calculation. "This is highly irregular, Your Honor. She has no standing in these proceedings." Judge Whitmore's face had gone red. "Young lady, this is not a television show. You cannot simply interrupt a trial. Sit down now, or I will have the bailiff remove you and hold you in contempt of court." Amara clutched her folder to her chest, feeling the weight of her research, her evidence, her father's freedom. She thought about all those civil rights heroes she had studied. They had all faced moments like this, moments when the safe choice was to be silent, to accept injustice, because fighting it seemed impossible. Every one of them had chosen to speak anyway. "Your Honor, I'm exercising my right as a citizen to present evidence under Rule 3.9 of the Alabama Rules of Criminal Procedure. The rule allows for the introduction of exculpatory evidence if there has been inadequate representation." The whispers grew louder. Judge Whitmore leaned forward, his knuckles white as he gripped the bench. "You're a child. You have no legal training, no standing in this court. You will sit down right now." Amara's voice didn't waver. "I'm a citizen who has discovered evidence that this jury deserves to see. Evidence that proves my father was physically unable to commit this crime. Evidence that identifies who actually drove that car. If you refuse to hear it, you're denying my father his constitutional right to present a defense." Walsh jumped in. "She's not an attorney. She can't introduce evidence or examine witnesses. This is absurd." But something unexpected happened. Mrs. Eleanor Price, the court clerk, who had been sitting silently at her desk throughout the trial, stood up. "Your Honor, if I may." Whitmore turned to her, clearly annoyed at another interruption. "What is it, Mrs. Price?" The elderly woman's voice was calm but firm. The young lady is correct about Rule 3.9. Alabama Code Section 15-14-20 allows for the supplemental presentation of exculpatory evidence if procedural inadequacy can be demonstrated. Given the defense attorney's failure to authenticate and introduce readily available evidence, there is a legal basis for the court to hear additional material. The courtroom went absolutely silent. A court clerk had just contradicted a judge in open court, citing law that supported a 15-year-old girl's position. It was unprecedented. Walsh sputtered, "Your Honor, you cannot allow this." Whitmore's eyes narrowed as he looked at Mrs. Price, then at Amara, then at the gallery where several reporters had appeared, drawn by word of the dramatic trial. Amara could see the calculation happening behind his eyes. If he refused now, he created perfect grounds for appeal. The conversation she had recorded would show consciousness of bias. He was trapped by his own corruption. His voice, when it came, was ice cold. "Very well. Miss Thompson, you will have 15 minutes tomorrow morning to present your evidence. One procedural error, one improper question, and I will terminate your presentation immediately and hold you in contempt. Do you understand?" Amara nodded, not trusting her voice. "Court is adjourned until 9 o'clock tomorrow." The gavel slammed again. As the courtroom emptied, people stared at Amara with expressions ranging from admiration to hostility. The reporters tried to approach, but were shooed away by bailiffs. Marcus reached her first, pulling her into a tight hug. "What did you just do?" He whispered it into her hair, and she couldn't tell if he was proud or terrified, probably both. Stephen Bradley was furious. "You just sabotaged your own father's case. Do you have any idea what you've done? If you fail tomorrow, Whitmore will make an example of both of you." Outside the courthouse, a small group of black community members waited. Some offered encouraging words. Others looked concerned. Mrs. Price approached Amara quietly. "Come to my house tonight. Bring all your evidence. We need to prepare." That night in Mrs. Price's small living room, surrounded by law books and case files, Amara worked with desperate intensity. Mrs. Price had called someone, and at 10 o'clock there was a knock at the door. The man who entered was in his late 70s, black, with white hair and sharp, intelligent eyes that missed nothing. James Wilson had been a civil rights attorney in the 1960s, had worked with the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, had argued cases that helped dismantle Jim Crow laws. He was a legend in Alabama's black legal community, now retired but still sharp as ever. "Mrs. Price thought you might need help." Wilson sat down and held out his hand for Amara's materials. She gave him everything: her timeline, her analysis of the security footage, her documentation of the cell phone records, her observations about Derek Callahan. He read in silence for over an hour while Amara sat on pins and needles. Finally he looked up. "This is excellent work. You've done better legal analysis than half the attorneys I've supervised. But Whitmore is going to try to tear you apart tomorrow. He won't ask you questions about the evidence. He'll attack your credibility, your age, your right to even be speaking. You need to be ready for that." For the next 6 hours, James Wilson coached Amara. He taught her how to respond to judicial hostility, how to introduce evidence with proper foundation, how to speak to the jury rather than the judge, how to maintain composure under attack. He role-played scenarios, playing a hostile judge while she practiced presenting her evidence. He was brutal in his critiques, interrupting her, insulting her, recreating the pressure she would face. Again, you're letting him rattle you. When he says you're out of order, you cite the rule that gives you standing. When he tries to cut you off, you calmly but firmly assert your right to complete your presentation. Remember, you're not asking for permission. You're exercising a right. They practiced introducing the cell phone records, authenticating the security footage from Marcus's shop, establishing timeline inconsistencies. Wilson showed her how to lay proper foundation for each piece of evidence, how to preempt objections, how to speak in clear, simple language that would resonate with the jury. Most importantly, he taught her about Derek Callahan. You have circumstantial evidence that he's lying, but you need to present it in a way that creates inevitable conclusions without making speculative leaps. Lead the jury to the truth. Don't tell them what to think. Show them the facts and let them draw the obvious conclusion. At 3 in the morning, Mrs. Price made coffee and sandwiches. Amara was exhausted but wired, running on adrenaline and determination. Wilson reviewed her presentation one more time, making final adjustments. You're ready. Tomorrow, you walk in there with confidence. You know the law better than that public defender. You've done the work he should have done. Don't let Whitmore or Walsh intimidate you. As Amara prepared to leave, Wilson handed her one more thing, a copy of the case Alabama versus Morrison from 1998. The decision clearly established that family members could present exculpatory evidence when counsel was demonstrably inadequate. It was her shield against Whitmore's attempts to silence her. But lying in bed that night at home, unable to sleep, Amara realized she was still missing something crucial. She could prove Marcus didn't drive the car. She could prove the timeline was impossible. But that wasn't enough. Walsh would argue someone else from the shop drove it, that Marcus orchestrated it. Amara needed to prove who actually committed the hit and run. She pulled out the police report again, reading it for the 100th time. Derek Callahan had reported the Mercedes stolen at 9:15 p.m., but he had dropped it at Marcus's shop at 7:30. The hit and run occurred at 8:45. That meant the car was at Marcus's shop during the accident. So how did Callahan know it was stolen if Marcus had it? Unless Callahan knew because he had taken it back. Amara jumped out of bed and powered on her laptop. She pulled up the security footage from Marcus's shop, fast-forwarding through the evening. Marcus working on the car, methodical and thorough, customers coming and going. Then at 8:30, a figure appeared. Amara paused the video, enhanced the image as much as her basic software allowed. Derek Callahan, entering the shop through a side door that Marcus sometimes left unlocked for regular customers. Callahan moved quickly to the Mercedes, got in, and drove away. Timestamp 8:31. Amara's heart was racing. She checked the timeline again. Callahan took the car at 8:31. The accident occurred at 8:45. Callahan reported it stolen at 9:15. He had committed the hit and run in his own car, then reported it stolen to create an alibi. He had deliberately brought it to Marcus's shop earlier as a setup, knowing he could retrieve it, use it, and blame the theft on a black mechanic no one would believe. She had him. Not just proof of Marcus's innocence, but proof of Callahan's guilt. The sun was rising as Amara printed out screenshots, organized her evidence, and prepared for the most important 15 minutes of her life. Amara arrived at the courthouse at 7:30, 2 hours before the trial was scheduled to resume. She wore the same dress as the day before, now slightly wrinkled from a sleepless night, but she carried herself differently. James Wilson's coaching had given her confidence, and more importantly, she had the truth organized into an undeniable presentation. Her mother came with her, both to provide support and because she couldn't bear to let Amara face this alone. Marcus was already there, brought early by transport from the holding facility where defendants waited. He looked haggard, eyes red from lack of sleep, but when he saw Amara with her folders and her determined expression, something in his face shifted from despair to something fragile. Hope. The courtroom filled quickly. Word had spread about the teenage girl challenging Judge Whitmore, and the gallery was packed with spectators. Reporters lined the walls, cameras ready outside the courthouse, since recording wasn't allowed inside. The black community had turned out in force, filling the left side of the gallery in a show of silent solidarity. The right side was equally full, mostly white faces that looked skeptical or outright hostile. At precisely 9 o'clock, Judge Whitmore entered. If he was bothered by the packed courtroom, he didn't show it. He sat, arranged his papers with meticulous precision, and fixed Amara with a stare that could have frozen fire. "Miss Thompson, you claim to have evidence. You have 15 minutes, not a second more. Make it count." Amara stood, gathered her materials, and walked to the defense table. Stephen Bradley looked like he wanted to disappear. She laid out her folders, took a breath, and turned to face the jury. "Ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to show you how an innocent man was framed." She started with the timeline, projecting the cell phone records on the courtroom screen with Mrs. Price's help. These records show that at 8:45 p.m., when the prosecution claims my father was driving the stolen Mercedes 3 miles from his shop, he was actually at his shop making a phone call to Granger Auto Parts. This isn't a guess. This is verified by cell tower data, which you can see here. The signal bounced off this tower, which only services the area where his shop is located. It's impossible for him to have been in both places simultaneously. Walsh stood immediately. Objection. Improper foundation. The witness hasn't been qualified to interpret cell phone data. Amara didn't hesitate, exactly as Wilson had coached her. Your Honor, I'm not interpreting the data. I'm presenting business records from the phone company, which are self-authenticating under Rule 902 of the Federal Rules of Evidence, adopted by Alabama. The records speak for themselves. Whitmore looked annoyed but had to nod. Overruled. Continue. Amara moved to the security footage from Marcus's shop. She played the video on the screen, showing Marcus working continuously through the evening. You can see my father here, working on the Mercedes. He never leaves the property. The timestamps are verified by the digital recording system and match other documented activities. At 9:15, he orders dinner delivery, which is confirmed by this receipt. Multiple independent sources confirm he was at his shop the entire evening. Then she showed the second piece of footage, the one she had discovered early that morning. At 8:31 p.m., Derek Callahan enters the shop through this side door. He approaches the Mercedes, gets in, and drives away. 14 minutes later, the hit and run occurs 3 miles from here. The courtroom erupted in gasps and whispers. Whitmore banged his gavel. Order. Walsh was on her feet. Your Honor, this is outrageous. Where did this footage come from? How do we know it hasn't been doctored? Amara responded calmly. This footage is from the same security system the prosecution authenticated when they used images from it in their case. It's the same digital format, same timestamp system. If their footage is reliable, this footage is equally reliable. Whitmore's jaw tightened, but he couldn't refute the logic. Objection overruled. Amara continued, building her case piece by piece. She presented Marcus's work order, showing photos of the Mercedes when Callahan first dropped it off. As you can see, there's no front-end damage at 7:30 when Mr. Callahan brought the car in. But police photos taken after Mr. Callahan reported it stolen show extensive damage to the front bumper and hood. That damage occurred between 7:30 and 9:15, during the time the car was supposedly stolen. She pulled up the police report. Mr. Callahan reported his car stolen at 9:15. But how did he know it was stolen if my father had it for legitimate repairs? The answer is, he knew because he had just taken it back. He committed the hit and run in his own vehicle, then reported it stolen to create an alibi. Walsh objected again, her voice rising. Speculation. She's leading the jury to conclusions not supported by evidence. Amara met Walsh's eyes. I'm presenting facts. Mr. Callahan dropped off his car at 7:30. Video shows him taking it at 8:31. An accident occurred at 8:45. He reported it stolen at 9:15. These are all verified facts. The jury can draw their own conclusions about what those facts mean. Some of the jurors were nodding. Others looked confused or conflicted, but all of them were paying attention in a way they hadn't during Bradley's defense. Amara pressed forward. She presented phone records showing Callahan had called his insurance company at 8:55, 20 minutes before reporting the theft. Why would someone call their insurance company about a car they didn't yet know was stolen? Because he had just been in an accident and was creating a paper trail. She showed financial records, legally obtained through public sources, demonstrating that Callahan had significant debts. He owed money to multiple creditors, had maxed out credit cards, was facing a potential bankruptcy. The insurance payout from a stolen and damaged vehicle would have been substantial. Motive. Then came the most damaging evidence. Amara pulled up a police report from 5 years earlier. Mr. Callahan has a sealed DUI conviction from 2020. He was arrested for drunk driving with a blood alcohol content twice the legal limit. His license was suspended for 6 months. This establishes a pattern of behavior. reckless driving, disregard for consequences, willingness to endanger others. Walsh was practically shouting now. That record was sealed. She has no right to present it. Amara looked at the judge. It was sealed in criminal proceedings but remains available through civil discovery and Freedom of Information Act requests for public safety purposes. I obtained it legally through the county records office. Whitmore looked like he wanted to sustain the objection, but he knew every eye in the courtroom was on him, including those of reporters who would dissect every decision. He took too long to respond, and in that hesitation, the damage was done. The jury had heard about Callahan's DUI. Finally, Amara turned to address the timeline impossibility one more time. She projected everything on one screen. Callahan's drop-off at 7:30, his return and theft of his own car at 8:31, the accident at 8:45, his insurance call at 8:55, his police report at 9:15, Marcus's alibi for the entire period. This is not circumstantial evidence, ladies and gentlemen. This is a documented chain of events that proves my father could not have committed this crime and points directly to who did. The 15 minutes were up. Whitmore looked at the clock, then at Amara. Your time is expired. Return to your seat. But the damage was done. Amara had dismantled the prosecution's case with methodical precision. The jury looked uncertain, several members whispering to each other. Walsh requested a recess, which Whitmore granted, probably needing time to figure out how to salvage the prosecution. During the break, Marcus hugged Amara so tightly she could barely breathe. You did it, baby. You actually did it. But Amara wasn't celebrating yet. She had presented the evidence, but Walsh would counterattack. The DA returned from recess with a new strategy, calling rebuttal witnesses who tried to cast doubt on the security footage timestamps, suggesting they could have been manipulated. She brought in an expert who testified that cell tower data could be inaccurate, that phones could ping off wrong towers. She hammered away at Amara's youth and lack of legal training, implying her analysis was amateur and unreliable. But Amara had prepared for this. During the rebuttal phase, she was allowed to respond. With James Wilson silently coaching from the gallery, Amara systematically destroyed each counterargument. She presented technical documentation from the security system manufacturer proving the timestamps couldn't be altered without leaving digital traces. She cited telecommunications studies showing cell tower accuracy rates above 99% for calls, as opposed to passive location tracking. She remained calm, professional, citing sources for every claim. The jury watched this 15-year-old girl defend her father with the skill of an experienced attorney, and their expressions shifted. What had seemed like an open and shut case now looked like something else entirely. A rush to judgment, a convenient prosecution, possible injustice. Judge Whitmore tried to maintain control, but the trial had slipped away from him. When Walsh finally rested, he had no choice but to send the jury to deliberate. Ladies and gentlemen, you have heard all the evidence. You must determine whether the prosecution has proven beyond a reasonable doubt that Marcus Thompson is guilty of the charges. Consider all testimony and evidence presented. He gave instructions that were technically proper, but lacked the subtle bias he had shown earlier. The jury filed out at 4:30 in the afternoon. Marcus, Amara, and Linda waited in a small conference room, unable to eat, barely able to breathe. 40 minutes later, there was a knock. The jury had reached a verdict. Back in the courtroom, Amara's heart hammered as the jury foreman stood. The foreman was a 62-year-old white man named Carl Henderson, a retired postal worker who had seemed skeptical of everything throughout the trial. On the count of grand theft auto, how do you find? We find the defendant not guilty. The courtroom exploded. On the count of receiving stolen property, how do you find? We find the defendant not guilty. Marcus collapsed into his chair, sobbing. Linda screamed with joy. The black community members cheered. Reporters rushed out to file their stories. Judge Whitmore banged his gavel repeatedly, his face a mask of barely contained fury. But he couldn't change the verdict. The jury had spoken. Order. Order in this court. He turned to Marcus. Mr. Thompson, you are free to go. All charges are dismissed. Then Whitmore did something unexpected. Bailiff, arrest Derek Callahan for perjury and obstruction of justice. There was a commotion as bailiffs moved through the courtroom. Callahan, who had been sitting in the back gallery, tried to leave but was intercepted. As he was handcuffed, he turned and looked directly at Amara. His expression was pure hatred. "This isn't over. You have no idea what you've done." The threat was clear, hanging in the air as Callahan was led away. Amara felt a chill despite the victory. The courthouse steps were chaos. Reporters surrounded Amara and her family, shouting questions, cameras flashing. Teen attorney saves father. Judge's bias exposed. Innocent man freed by daughter's courage. The headlines wrote themselves. Amara found herself thrust into a spotlight she had never wanted or prepared for. Her mother tried to shield her, but the questions kept coming. "Amara, how does it feel to save your father? What made you think you could take on the legal system? Will you pursue charges against Judge Whitmore?" She mumbled answers, overwhelmed, just wanting to go home. But going home meant returning to a neighborhood that hadn't fully supported them, to a shop that had been vandalized and seized, to a life that had been shattered and wouldn't simply rebuild because of one verdict. The first few days after the trial felt surreal. Marcus was released that evening, free for the first time in weeks. The family spent that night together, barely speaking, just grateful to be in the same room without handcuffs or guards. But reality intruded quickly. Marcus's auto shop was returned to him, but it was in ruins. During the seizure, equipment had been removed, files scattered, and at some point vandals had broken in. Racial slurs were spray-painted across the walls in angry red letters. Tools were stolen or destroyed. The cost of repairs would be enormous, and they had no savings left after bail and legal fees. Customers who had once been loyal now seemed hesitant. Some called to offer congratulations and support, promising to bring their business back, but others simply disappeared. The white customers who had made up nearly 40% of Marcus's business were gone, scared off by the publicity, by their own racial prejudices, or by simple discomfort with the controversy. Even some black customers stayed away, perhaps worried that associating with Marcus would bring them unwanted attention. The family's finances were desperate. Linda picked up extra nursing shifts, working herself to exhaustion. Marcus tried to rebuild the shop, but without income, he couldn't afford to replace stolen equipment or pay for repairs. The insurance company was suddenly slow to process claims, citing the criminal case as a complicating factor, even though Marcus had been acquitted. They were drowning, and the victory in court felt increasingly hollow. Amara's situation at school became worse instead of better. She had hoped vindication would ease the social isolation, but it had the opposite effect. White students who had merely avoided her before now openly resented her. Someone started a rumor that she had lied in court, that her father was actually guilty and had gotten away with it because of a technicality. Her locker was vandalized repeatedly. Teachers treated her with a mixture of pity and suspicion, as if she had disrupted the natural order. Even some black students kept their distance, worried that befriending Amara would make them targets. The school administration called her in for a meeting 3 days after the trial. Principal Margaret Hendricks, a white woman in her 50s, sat behind her desk with a concerned expression that didn't reach her eyes. "Amara, we're worried about you. This whole situation has been very traumatic. We think it might be best if you took some time off, perhaps transferred to another school where you could have a fresh start." Amara understood what was really being said. They wanted her gone because she was inconvenient, a reminder that the system had tried to destroy her family. "No thank you, Mrs. Hendricks. I'm staying." The principal's smile tightened. "Well, if you change your mind, the offer stands. But Amara, you need to understand that what happened in that courtroom, it doesn't reflect well on our legal system. Some people, important people in this community, are very upset. It would be wise to keep a low profile." It was a threat dressed up as advice. Amara left the office feeling sick. At home that evening, the threats became less subtle. The family's phone rang constantly with anonymous callers leaving vicious messages. "You should have kept your mouth shut. Black girl doesn't know her place. Your father got lucky, but luck runs out. Someone threw a brick through their living room window at 2 in the morning, wrapped in a note that said, "Next time it won't be a brick." The police took a report but did little else. One officer actually said, "You folks stirred up a lot of trouble. People are angry. Maybe lay low for a while." Marcus wanted to fight back, to demand protection, but he was exhausted and scared. What good did it do to win in court if they were going to be terrorized at home? 3 nights later, Marcus's auto shop caught fire. The blaze started around midnight, engulfing the building before firefighters could respond. By morning, Thompson's auto repair was nothing but charred rubble and melted metal. The fire inspector ruled it suspicious, likely arson, but had no leads on who might be responsible. Marcus stood in the ruins of his life's work and wept. Everything he had built, all those years of labor and sacrifice, reduced to ash. The insurance company immediately launched their own investigation, implying the fire might have been set by Marcus himself for the payout. They froze the claim, leaving the family with no income and no prospects. That night, Amara heard her parents arguing in their bedroom, her mother crying that maybe they should just leave Alabama, start over somewhere else. Her father's response was defeated. "We can't afford to leave. We have nothing." The victory had turned to ashes as surely as the auto shop. A week after the fire, Amara received a certified letter at home. Her hands shook as she opened it, already knowing it wasn't good news. The letter was from the Alabama State Bar Association, official and coldly formal. It informed her that Judge Harold Whitmore had filed a formal complaint against her for unauthorized practice of law. The complaint alleged that Amara had violated Alabama Code Section 34-3-6 by presenting evidence, examining witnesses, and providing legal representation without a license. The potential penalties were severe, fines up to $50,000, a permanent prohibition from ever applying to law school or taking the bar exam in Alabama, a criminal misdemeanor charge that would mar her record forever. Amara read the letter 3 times, unable to process it. She had saved her father from prison, exposed corruption, and now she was being punished for it. This was Whitmore's revenge. He had lost the battle in court, but he was determined to destroy her future. She couldn't afford $50,000 in fines. Her dream of becoming an attorney, the goal that had driven her entire life, was being taken away because she had dared to challenge the system. That night, Amara lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, feeling the weight of everything crushing down. She had won the battle and lost the war. Her father was free but financially ruined. Her family was safe but terrorized. She had proven the system was corrupt, but was now being destroyed by that same system in retaliation. What had it all been for? In the darkness, she heard her mother crying softly in the next room, heard her father pacing downstairs, unable to sleep. She had saved him from prison, only to watch their entire lives crumble anyway. Maybe that public defender had been right. Maybe she should have just accepted the plea deal, let her father serve a few years, and at least kept her own future intact. Now they had nothing. The hearing for the Bar Association complaint was scheduled for 3 months away. Amara tried to continue with school, but it was impossible to focus. Her grades, once perfect, began to slip. She stopped doing homework, stopped caring. What was the point of studying if she could never become a lawyer anyway? James Wilson called several times, offering to help, but Amara didn't return his calls. Mrs. Price visited, bringing food and encouragement, but Amara could barely speak to her. She felt hollow, defeated in ways that the original trial had never accomplished. 2 months passed in a gray haze. Marcus tried to find work as a mechanic at other shops, but no one would hire him. The publicity made him toxic. Some employers said it outright. "I believe you're innocent, man, but I can't take the heat of having you here." Bills piled up. The mortgage was 3 months behind. Eviction notices appeared on their door. Linda worked every shift she could get, but it wasn't enough. The American dream they had worked so hard to achieve was turning into a nightmare. Amara watched her family disintegrate, knowing it was her fault. If she had just stayed quiet, taken the plea deal, her father would be in prison, but they would at least have a home, her mother wouldn't be working herself to death, and Amara would still have a future. The night before the Bar Association hearing, Amara wrote a letter. She apologized to her parents for destroying their lives. She said she loved them and was sorry for being selfish, for thinking she could fight a system designed to crush people like them. She left the letter on her desk and walked to the bathroom, staring at the medicine cabinet where her mother kept various prescription medications from her nursing work. It would be easy. Just take enough pills, go to sleep, and stop being a burden. Her hand was on the cabinet door when her father knocked. "Baby? You okay in there?" His voice was gentle, concerned. Amara's hand fell away from the cabinet. She opened the door. Her father looked at her, really looked at her, and seemed to see everything she was feeling. He pulled her into a hug. "None of this is your fault. You saved me. You fought when no one else would. I'm so proud of you. But Daddy, everything's falling apart. I ruined our lives." Marcus held her tighter. "You gave me my freedom. You exposed corruption. You showed this whole state that a 15-year-old black girl is smarter and braver than their entire legal system. That matters, baby. Even if everything else falls apart, that matters." They stood there in the hallway, holding each other, and Amara felt something shift. She was tired of being beaten down, tired of watching her family suffer because the system demanded revenge for being challenged. If they were going to destroy her anyway, she might as well fight until the very end. The morning of the Bar Association hearing, Amara woke with new determination. She dressed carefully in the same outfit she had worn to trial, the dress now carrying the weight of history. Her mother braided her hair while offering quiet prayers. Her father squeezed her shoulder. "You've got this." James Wilson had agreed to represent her, working pro bono despite his retirement. He picked them up at 8, driving them to the Bar Association offices in downtown Montgomery. The building was modern glass and steel, a stark contrast to the old courthouse, but it felt just as intimidating. The hearing room was smaller than a courtroom, more like a conference room with a long table where 3 Bar Association officials Saturday 7-2 heaven win. Judge Harold Whitmore was already there, looking dignified in an expensive suit, his attorney beside him. He didn't acknowledge Amara's entrance, but she felt his presence like a physical weight. The proceedings began with opening statements. Whitmore's attorney, a polished man named Richard Chambers, presented the case against Amara with clinical precision. Miss Thompson, despite her age and good intentions, clearly violated state law by practicing law without a license. She presented evidence, examined witnesses, and provided legal representation in a criminal trial. Alabama code is explicit. These actions are prohibited and must be sanctioned to maintain the integrity of our legal profession. Whitmore himself testified, his voice measured and reasonable. "I understand the young lady was trying to help her father. But we have rules for a reason. Allowing untrained individuals to practice law puts defendants at risk and undermines public confidence in our judicial system. If we excuse Miss Thompson's actions, what's to stop anyone from claiming they can practice law because they've read some books?" He painted himself as the defender of legal standards, conveniently omitting his bias, his corruption, his conspiracy with the prosecutor. James Wilson stood for Amara's defense, and his opening statement cut through the pretense. This hearing is not about protecting legal standards. It's about punishing a young black girl who had the audacity to expose judicial corruption and save her innocent father from a rigged system. Judge Whitmore isn't defending legal ethics. He's seeking revenge because Miss Thompson made him look like the biased judge he is. Chambers objected immediately. That's inflammatory and irrelevant. The chair of the panel, an older white attorney named Douglas Freeman, sustained the objection. "Let's keep this professional, Mr. Wilson." Wilson nodded but continued. "Miss Thompson acted under Alabama v. Morrison, which explicitly allows family members to present exculpatory evidence when counsel is inadequate. She followed proper procedure, cited relevant law, and saved an innocent man. Her actions were legal and heroic." The hearing continued with testimony. Whitmore's side called legal experts, who testified about the dangers of unauthorized practice, about how Amara's actions set dangerous precedents. They made it sound like she had committed a grave offense against justice itself. When it was Wilson's turn, he played the recording. The audio of Judge Whitmore and D.A. Walsh discussing how they needed the conviction, how one more black criminal off the streets wouldn't hurt anyone. The room went silent. Freeman's expression shifted from skeptical to shocked. The other panel members leaned forward, listening intently. Chambers tried to object. That recording was obtained without consent. It's inadmissible, Wilson smiled coldly. This isn't a criminal trial. It's an administrative hearing. Different rules apply. And regardless of admissibility, that recording shows why Miss Thompson had to act. Her father was facing a judge who had already decided to convict him regardless of evidence. She didn't practice law. She exercised her constitutional right to prevent a miscarriage of justice. Then Wilson called his own witness. Mrs. Eleanor Price took the stand, testifying about Whitmore's pattern of bias, about the dozens of black defendants who had been railroaded through his courtroom over 15 years. She brought documentation, statistics, appeals that had been filed and dismissed. She painted a picture of systemic racism that made Amara's actions not just justified but necessary. The tide was turning. Freeman asked questions that suggested his thinking had shifted. Miss Thompson, why did you feel compelled to act yourself rather than relying on appointed counsel? Amara answered clearly, because the public defender had given up. He told my father to take a plea deal even though he was innocent. He failed to present evidence that proved my dad's alibi. If I hadn't acted, an innocent man would have gone to prison for 20 years. The system failed us. I had no choice. Freeman nodded slowly. And you studied the relevant law before presenting your evidence? Yes, sir. I spent weeks researching Alabama criminal procedure, evidence rules, and case law. I made sure everything I did was legal and proper. Another panel member, a black woman named Justice Patricia Monroe, spoke up. Weren't you afraid? You're a child confronting a powerful judge. Amara met her eyes. I was terrified, but my father taught me that doing what's right matters more than doing what's easy. Watching him go to prison for a crime he didn't commit wasn't an option. After 4 hours of testimony, the panel recessed to deliberate. Amara sat with her family in the waiting area, unable to eat the sandwiches her mother had brought, unable to think about anything except what would happen if she lost. If they imposed the fines, her family would be bankrupted. If they prohibited her from ever practicing law, her dream died. An hour later, they were called back. Freeman delivered the panel's decision. After careful consideration of all evidence and testimony, this panel finds that Miss Amara Thompson did not engage in unauthorized practice of law. Her actions fell within the exception established by Alabama v. Morrison for family members presenting exculpatory evidence. Furthermore, we find that her actions were necessitated by inadequate counsel and judicial bias. Amara felt tears streaming down her face. All charges and potential sanctions are dismissed. Freeman paused, then continued with unexpected passion. We also recommend that this case be forwarded to the Judicial Inquiry Commission for investigation into Judge Whitmore's conduct. The recorded conversation and pattern of bias documented today warrant formal review. Whitmore stood abruptly. This is outrageous. You're taking the word of a child over a sitting judge. Freeman's voice was ice. We're taking documented evidence of corruption seriously, Your Honor. As we should have done long ago, the hearing was adjourned. As people filed out, Whitmore approached Amara. She instinctively stepped back, but he didn't come closer. He just looked at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. You think you've won, but you've made powerful enemies. This isn't over. Then he left, his attorney following. James Wilson put his hand on Amara's shoulder. Don't listen to him. You did win. But more than that, you started something. That investigation he's worried about? It's going to expose decades of corruption. Amara wanted to feel triumphant, but Whitmore's words echoed in her mind. Powerful enemies. The fight wasn't over. Over the next weeks, things began to shift. The Judicial Inquiry Commission launched a formal investigation into Whitmore. Reporters started digging into his past cases, finding pattern after pattern of bias. Other black defendants who had been convicted in his courtroom began filing appeals, using the recorded conversation as evidence of judicial misconduct. The pressure mounted until Whitmore was faced with a choice: resign or face formal impeachment proceedings that would drag through the courts for years, exposing every decision he had ever made to scrutiny. 3 weeks after the Bar Association hearing, Judge Harold Whitmore announced his retirement, effective immediately. He gave no interviews, made no statements. He simply disappeared from public life, his 30-year judicial career ending in disgrace. Derek Callahan's case proceeded to trial. The investigation into his background revealed that the hit-and-run was just the beginning. He had been running an insurance fraud scheme, using Marcus's shop and others like it as unwitting accomplices. He would damage his own vehicles, claim they were stolen or vandalized, and collect insurance payouts. The hit-and-run happened because he was drunk and reckless, and framing Marcus was simply the most convenient way to avoid consequences. Callahan was convicted on multiple counts of insurance, fraud, perjury, and vehicular assault. He was sentenced to 20 years in federal prison. As he was led away after sentencing, he looked one last time at Amara, who had attended every day of his trial. His expression was pure hatred, but also defeat. The black community in Montgomery began to rally in ways they hadn't before. Marcus's burn shop became a cause. Fundraisers were organized, thousands donated, and within 2 months they had enough money to rebuild. Local contractors offered their services at cost, and slowly, Thompson's auto repair rose from the ashes, bigger and better than before. But the most unexpected development came 6 months after Amara's Bar Association hearing. An envelope arrived at their home, thick and official-looking. Amara opened it with trembling hands. The letter was from Stanford Law School, one of the most prestigious legal education institutions in the country. Amara read the first paragraph 3 times, unable to believe what she was seeing. "Dear Miss Thompson, we have followed your extraordinary case with great interest. Your courage, legal acumen, and commitment to justice at such a young age have deeply impressed our admissions committee." But this wasn't a standard college recruitment letter. Stanford was offering something unprecedented. "We would like to extend an invitation for you to join our Early Admission Legal Scholars Program, a special initiative for exceptional students who demonstrate remarkable aptitude for legal thinking. This program would allow you to begin your undergraduate pre-law education immediately, completing your high school requirements through independent study while taking college-level courses at Stanford. Upon completion, you would transition directly into our law school. Full scholarship, room and board included, stipend for expenses." They were offering her a path to become an attorney years ahead of schedule, recognizing that she had already proven herself more capable than many practicing lawyers. Amara showed the letter to her parents. Her mother cried. Her father picked her up and spun her around despite her being 15 and nearly as tall as him. But the decision wasn't simple. Accepting meant leaving her family when they still needed her, moving across the country to California, starting over in an environment where she would be surrounded by privileged students who had never faced anything like what she had endured. Amara spent a week agonizing over the choice. James Wilson came by to offer advice. "Take it. You've earned this, and your family will be fine. I'll keep working on getting your father's reputation fully restored, and Linda's going to be okay." "You can't sacrifice your future out of guilt," Mrs. Price agreed. "Baby, you fought so hard for this chance. Don't throw it away. Your parents want you to succeed." Marcus was adamant. "Go. Live your dream. Make all of this mean something." Amara accepted the offer with the condition that she could return home every few months to visit. Stanford agreed, even arranging for travel expenses. 2 weeks before she was scheduled to leave for California, something else happened. The FBI announced a broader investigation into insurance fraud schemes across Alabama, sparked by the evidence uncovered in Derek Callahan's case. The investigation revealed a network of corruption, involving multiple mechanics shops, insurance adjusters, and even some law enforcement officers. Marcus Thompson was publicly cleared of any wrongdoing and praised for his meticulous documentation that had helped break the case. His reputation was not just restored, but enhanced. Customers returned, and new ones came, specifically because they knew he was honest. The rebuilt Thompson's Auto Repair thrived, busier than it had ever been. But the real vindication came from an unexpected source. The Montgomery County Commission issued a formal apology to Marcus and Amara, acknowledging the systemic failures that had nearly destroyed their family. They announced reforms to the public defender system, mandatory bias training for judges, and new oversight procedures for criminal cases. It wasn't enough to fix everything, but it was a start. Amara's last week in Montgomery was a whirlwind. The black community threw her a going-away party, raising money to help furnish her dorm room and buy supplies. Jefferson High School, which had tried to push her out, now wanted to celebrate her, offering to name a scholarship in her honor. She declined, instead suggesting they use the money to fund legal education resources for students who couldn't afford them. The night before her flight to California, Amara sat on the porch with her father, watching the sun set over their neighborhood. "You scared me, you know." Marcus's voice was quiet. "Standing up in that courtroom, I thought Whitmore was going to destroy you." Amara leaned against his shoulder. "Were you mad?" Marcus was quiet for a long moment. "I was terrified, but also more proud than I've ever been of anything. You showed me that the system can be beaten if you're brave enough and smart enough. That matters. What about the stuff that happened after? The fire, the threats, the bar association thing?" Her father sighed. "Those were consequences of challenging power. People who benefit from injustice don't give up easily. But you survived, and now you're going to become the kind of lawyer who keeps fighting." That scares them more than anything. The next morning, at the airport, her mother held her for a long time. "Be safe, study hard. Come home when you can." Her father just squeezed her hand and nodded, too emotional to speak. As Amara's plane took off, she looked down at Montgomery, the city that had tried to break her family, that had tested her in ways she never imagined. She thought about everything that had happened, all the pain and struggle. She thought about her father in an orange jumpsuit, about standing in that courtroom defying a judge, about Whitmore's threats and Callahan's hatred. She thought about the system that had tried to crush them, and the community that had eventually rallied to their defense. Stanford was a new beginning, but Amara knew the fight wasn't over. There were thousands of families like hers, facing corrupt judges and inadequate defenders, trapped in a system designed to convict rather than seek truth. She was going to law school not just for herself, but for all of them. 2 years later, Amara stood once again on the steps of the Montgomery County Courthouse, but everything had changed. She was 17 now, home for summer break from Stanford, where she had completed her sophomore year with perfect grades while simultaneously finishing law school prerequisites. She had already been accepted into Stanford Law School's accelerated program and would begin her formal legal education in the fall. But she wasn't here as a student or a defendant's daughter. She had been invited to speak. The courthouse had undergone changes since her trial. Judge Maria Rodriguez, the first Latina judge ever appointed in Montgomery County, had taken over Whitmore's courtroom. The public defender's office had been reformed, with better funding and training. It wasn't perfect, but it was better. Today, the courthouse was hosting a legal rights workshop for high school students, teaching young people about their constitutional protections, how the criminal justice system worked, and how to advocate for themselves and others. Amara had been asked to be the keynote speaker. The auditorium was packed with students from every high school in the county, black, white, Latino, Asian, all backgrounds, all listening as Amara took the microphone. She saw her father in the audience, his auto shop now employing 6 mechanics and thriving. Her mother sat beside him, having recently been promoted to nursing supervisor, Mrs. Eleanor Price was there, retired now but beaming with pride. James Wilson sat in the front row. Age hadn't slowed his passion for justice. "I learned something important when I was 15 years old," Amara began, her voice carrying clearly through the room. "The law isn't just words in books. It's a tool. And like any tool, it can be used to harm or to heal. It can be wielded by those who seek to oppress or by those who refuse to be silent." She told her story, not sparing the difficult parts. The arrest, the bias, the threats, the fear. She talked about wanting to give up, about the nights she thought they would lose everything. But she also talked about fighting back, about learning the law, about standing up even when it felt impossible. "My father was facing 20 years in prison for a crime he didn't commit. simply because the system assumed a black mechanic must be guilty. I was just a 15-year-old girl who loved her father enough to fight. And that was enough. She talked about the importance of education, of understanding rights and procedures. She talked about the reality of systemic bias and how it had to be confronted. She talked about the cost of fighting injustice, how winning in court didn't immediately fix everything, how there were consequences for challenging power. Some of you will face similar situations. Maybe not in a courtroom, but in school, in your neighborhoods, in your lives. You'll see injustice and have to decide whether to speak up or stay silent. I'm telling you, speaking up is worth it. It's hard, and it's scary, and sometimes it feels like you're making things worse. But silence never fixed anything. She paused, looking at the young faces staring up at her. Many were black and brown kids who understood intimately what she was talking about. Others were white students who maybe were hearing this perspective for the first time. All of them were listening. The system isn't going to fix itself. It changes because people like us refuse to accept it as it is. Every time someone stands up, it gets a little easier for the next person. Every time we fight back, we create space for others to do the same. After the speech, there was a long question-and-answer session. Students asked about everything from how to handle police encounters to whether law school was worth it to how she dealt with fear. Amara answered each question honestly, not sugarcoating the difficulties but also not discouraging them from fighting for what was right. As the workshop concluded, a young black girl approached Amara. She looked about 13, nervous but determined. "Miss Thompson, my name is Jasmine Carter. My older brother was arrested last week. The police say he robbed a convenience store, but he was at home with me when it happened. Nobody believes us. Our lawyer says we should just take a plea deal. I don't know what to do." Amara felt time fold in on itself. She was looking at herself 2 years ago, desperate and terrified, facing a system that didn't care. She knelt down to Jasmine's eye level, making eye contact. "Tell me everything, and bring me any evidence you have. Phone records, witness statements, anything that proves he was home. We'll figure this out together." Jasmine's face lit up with hope. "Really? You'll help? I'll help. And I'll teach you how to help yourself, how to understand the law, how to fight back. You're not alone in this." As Jasmine left with her mother, both of them smiling for the first time in days, James Wilson approached Amara. "You're doing it." "Doing what?" "Changing the system, one person at a time." Amara watched Jasmine disappear into the crowd, already thinking about the case, about what evidence would be needed, about how to approach the public defender to either improve their representation or supplement it. She thought about all the other families out there facing similar situations, about how many other 13-year-old girls were watching their brothers or fathers or mothers get swallowed by a system that presumed guilt. Her phone buzzed. A text from her Stanford advisor reminding her about fall semester course selection. She had already chosen her classes: constitutional law, criminal procedure, civil rights litigation. She was building the skills to fight these battles on a larger scale, but she would never forget that every big case, every precedent, every systemic change started with individual people like Jasmine who needed help right now. Marcus approached, putting his arm around her shoulders. "Proud of you, baby. You could be relaxing this summer, but instead you're taking on new cases." Amara smiled. "I learned from the best. You never gave up, even when everything seemed hopeless. How could I do any less?" That evening, as Amara sat in her childhood bedroom reviewing the details of Jasmine's brother's case, she thought about the journey that had led her here. From that terrifying morning when police broke into their home, through the trial and the aftermath, through the Bar Association hearing and the threats, all the way to Stanford and back home again. She thought about Judge Whitmore, disgraced and retired, about Derek Callahan rotting in prison, about all the people who had tried to break her family and failed. But mostly she thought about the future, about law school, about eventually passing the bar and becoming a real attorney, about all the families she would help, all the injustices she would fight. The system that had tried to destroy her father had instead created something it feared even more: a young black woman who knew the law inside and out, who had learned how to fight from experience, and who would spend the rest of her life making sure that what happened to her family didn't happen to others. Her computer was open to a legal database, case law on wrongful arrests scrolling across the screen. Her notebooks were filled with strategies and questions for Jasmine's case. Tomorrow she would meet with the family, start building a defense, teach them how to navigate the system. It was what she did now, what she would always do. Before she went to sleep, Amara looked at a photo on her wall. Her father standing in front of the rebuilt Thompson's auto repair on opening day, smiling wider than she had seen him smile in years. Justice hadn't come easy, and it hadn't come cheap, but it had come. And now it was her job to make sure it kept coming, case by case, family by family, fighting until the system worked the way it was supposed to. For everyone. The law was a tool, and Amara had learned how to use it. She thought about that teenage girl who had stood up in Judge Whitmore's courtroom, terrified but determined, armed with nothing but research and love for her father. That girl had changed everything, and she was just getting started. Now let me ask you something. Have you ever witnessed or experienced injustice where you felt powerless to fight back? Maybe you've seen someone treated unfairly because of their race, their background, or their circumstances. Maybe you stayed silent because challenging authority seemed too dangerous or too hard. Amara's story shows us that knowledge is power, that courage can overcome even corrupt systems, and that sometimes the smallest voice in the room can speak the loudest truth. If this story moved you, if you believe in fighting for justice even when it seems impossible, please hit that like button and share this video with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe to our channel for more stories about ordinary people doing extraordinary things to challenge injustice and change the world. Drop a comment below telling us about a time you stood up for what was right, or what you would do if you faced a situation like Amara's. Your story matters. Your voice matters. Together, we can build a world where justice isn't just a word in a textbook, but a reality for everyone, regardless of race or circumstance. Thank you for listening to Amara's story. May it inspire you to be brave when bravery is needed, to be smart when wisdom is required, and to never ever accept injustice as inevitable. Stay strong, keep fighting, and remember that even when the system seems designed to break you, the truth has power. You have power. Use it well.